let's think about I'm think every time you're talking about the different diseases, and I'm thinking of COVID, right? And then
Right.
also kind of 2020 has been the year where we've all kind of become almost like mini kind of research experts trying to figure out what is COVID, how does it transmit, what does it do essentially? And I think even the experts still have their heads kind of scratched. I mean, we have a general sense for the main idea what it does, but maybe do you possibly know? I mean, we can just explain perhaps maybe more what COVID is, and also the how it transmits and
Yeah.
how it reacts with
Um,
microbes and stuff.
yeah. So I guess maybe the first thing is maybe just like what is a virus? Because I think people sort of think of um, people like, oh yeah, viruses, they're germs, they make people sick, yada yada yada. But I think a lot of people don't really understand exactly what is actually going on with a virus. And so and COVID is, I mean, it's interesting because COVID is special in that it has impacted like all of our lives in such a dramatic way. But in the grand scheme of like viruses, it is pretty, it's like another virus sort of. But anyway, so the way viruses work essentially is viruses can't replicate on their own. And what they do is they enter a host's cells and then they sort of hijack that cell so that that cell will make copies of the virus. And then once there's a bunch of copies of that virus in that cell, they sort of burst out, and then those copies can now infect other cells. And that's how viruses work. And so COVID basically does that. And there's a couple things that are maybe make it slightly different than other viruses. But essentially the way COVID sort of makes you sick is it goes into your system. It interacts. There's these like spike. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have seen pictures of like illustrations of what COVID sort of like should look like. And you see it has these like spike proteins on the outer shell of it, essentially on the outer membrane. And these spike proteins interact with receptors that tissues in your body have, specifically like your like, your nasopharyngeal passages and your lungs have these receptors, those spike proteins interact with those receptors, and then the virus enters those cells, and then they hijack those cells. So whatever those cells should be doing, now their job is to make more COVID. And it's almost like as far as I know, the virus doesn't actually like it doesn't get into your cells, and it doesn't like make toxins or anything that actually like kill your cells directly or something like that. The reason it makes you sick is because instead of those cells doing what they should be doing, they're now making virus. And just the byproduct of that is all of the symptoms that COVID winds up giving you essentially.
Sure. And now one of the things too that we've seen is that the virus doesn't necessarily, like, if you come into contact with somebody who has COVID, you don't immediately, like, you go get tested the next day, you may not necessarily, show
Right.
symptoms, but not even test positive. So maybe do viruses typically present themselves in ways like that where there's a latency period, or is this something that's kind of brand new?
Right. So that is typical of some viruses, definitely, and it's different for all of them, and there's just as many different types of viruses as there are anything else, basically. But yeah, and it sort of makes sense maybe if you think about it, like what exactly is happening in that the way you get COVID, like I said, is like some of it enters your system where these receptors exist on your cells, and then the COVID enters those cells and starts replicating. Excuse me. And what's happening essentially is let's say you get infected and like one COVID virus particle, which like this is not usually how it happens. Usually you get like a bunch of them at once that enter your system. But let's say one of them enters your system and infects one cell. If you get tested, one cell out of all the millions of cells that are even more than that cells that make up your body isn't like it's just a drop in the bucket, so it's not going to register essentially. But then as the days go by, that cell is going to produce more COVID molecules, which then affect other cells, and that's why over time you gain your viral load increases, essentially is what it's called. And yeah, as your viral load increases, then it becomes detectable. And then you can, and once your viral load increases, that's when more and more cells are affected, and that's when you start getting the symptoms as well. And so I think it makes sense that like based on what is happening, that's why you sort of get this latency period where you technically have been infected, you're not experiencing symptoms because it's not like this total takeover yet. essentially by the virus. And you don't test positive because the test is not sensitive enough, which I don't think a test could even exist. Like, it's not like a matter that our tests are bad or something like that.
Sure.
It's just like the test, I don't think a test could even exist that would be sensitive enough to detect it necessarily at that early level.